Hello. I wanted to start this presentation today by taking us all back to where it all started. I'm here at Canada Olympic Park, located in Calgary, Alberta. Canada Olympic Park was built for the 1988 Calgary Winter Olympic Games and has since operated as a legacy facility. This is also where I learned to ski at age 3 and took my first ski jumps only 4 years later at age 7. This place became a second home to me where I trained, competed, and even went to high school at the National Sports School. I experienced some of my greatest successes here and overcame some of my greatest barriers. One of those barriers was finding out that no women would be allowed to compete at the Vancouver 2010 Winter Olympic Games. My paper is an autoethnographic exploration in history and creative nonfiction writing to add the athlete voice to the history of women's ski jumping at the Olympics in the early 2000s, particularly with a focus on the contestation over the 2010 Vancouver Olympic Winter Games. In this paper, I ask, how did my experiences as a women's ski jumping athlete in Canada between 2007 and 2014 reflect the exclusion and discrimination women faced in the sport? And how did these experiences then become embodied in the sensations, emotions, and experiences of the ski jump? I argue that women ski jumpers contended with compounding discrimination and exclusion from their sport that negatively impacted their overall experiences. However, they practiced resistance by fostering intercommunity connections and determination to succeed in the face of doubt. Conceptualizing the ski jump as a metaphor for the experiences of women ski jumpers connects the body to the history of discrimination, exclusion, and gender stereotypes, and reveals new insights into how women ski jumpers flew in the face of adversity. I will first outline existing literature on women's ski jumping in the lawsuit, then move into points of departure. Hoffman documents the rich and extensive history of women's participation in ski jumping dating back to the 19th century. Vertinsky, Jett, and Hoffman argue that women's subordination in ski jumping is the legacy of long-standing patriarchal and patronizing views about female bodies and women's participation in sport, and include a discussion of the lawsuit filed by a group of women ski jumpers to be included in the 2010 Winter Olympic Games. Anderson and Lowland argued the exclusion of women ski jumpers was a violation of individual rights and threatened the self-respect of women jumpers. Laurendeau and Adams highlight the discursive silences and exclusion of women ski jumpers by the International Olympic Committee. I also position this work within the larger literature on the history and experiences of women and girls in sport, including Anne Hall, Jennifer Hargreaves, Patricia Vertinsky, Susan Birrell, and many others not mentioned that have captured and theorized the incredibly rich and varied experiences of women and girls in sport. My paper adds an athlete's perspective that is not captured in the current literature on women's ski jumping in the lawsuit Women Ski Jumpers filed. Based on reflexive narrative writing and drawing on sport historian Megan Popovich's work, I explore the sensations, emotions, and experiences of the ski jump, illustrating the connections between my body, power, and gender. I situate my autoethnographic exploration within the work of feminist sport historians and the recognition of autoethnography within sport history as a tool with the capacity to reveal how the past continues to influence the embodied experiences of female athletes. In order to understand my experiences as a woman ski jumper and how these experiences were shaped by patriarchal and patronizing culture of ski jumping and the women's ski jumping lawsuit, I must take you back to the beginning. I began ski jumping when I was 7 years old at Canada Olympic Park and belonged to the Altius Nordic Ski Club, which was the only active ski jumping club in Canada. Growing up in the sport and training alongside my brothers and teammates, I was unaware of the constraints, lack of opportunities, and hardships that I would face as a future athlete. Moving into my competitive years between 2007 and 2014, things began to change. During this time, I was on the Alberta provincial team and progressing onto the women's national and national development teams, competing on the Continental and World Cup circuit. While only 14 years old at the time, when a group of more senior women or elite women ski jumper athletes from the United States, Norway, Germany, Slovenia, and Canada decided to take Van Ock to court for not including a women's ski jumping event alongside the men's event at the 2010 Winter Olympic Games, I decided to join. The decision to join the fight and push for equality in the sport I loved was easy. However, it was also a large point of contention within the sport of ski jumping itself, my local club, teammates, and coaches. So I'll outline the lawsuit here. In May 2008, 10 women ski jumpers filed a lawsuit against the Vancouver Olympic Organizing Committee in an effort to get a women's ski jumping event into the 2010 Winter Olympic Games. Plaintiffs argued that their exclusion from the Games was because of gender discrimination, which violated Section 15 of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. In May 2009, at only 14 years old, I joined the lawsuit with 4 of my other teammates. July 2009, a BC Supreme Court judge found the exclusion of women ski jumpers from the Winter Olympic Games to be discriminatory. However, it was also not in the power of VANOC to add or remove events, and the IOC did not need to abide by the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. In November 2009, women ski jumpers appealed the decision to the BC Court of Appeal, but their appeal was denied. In December 2009, in a last effort, women ski jumpers took the case to the Supreme Court of Canada, but they unfortunately refused to hear the appeal. In the end, this ended the possible legal avenues we were pursuing and ultimately meant that no women ski jumpers would be competing at the 2010 Winter Olympic Games in February. While we did receive some support and encouragement from our allies, other athletes, coaches, ski jumping officials, high-level administrators in the IOC and FIS, and members of the public did not agree with the path we had chosen. They argued that, "I hope the girls don't waste their time and make this a human rights issue. That's silly, and all that would do is piss people off. That's not the issue at all," said Dick Pound, Canadian member of the IOC in 2004. Brent Morris, the chair of Ski Jumping Canada, quoted in 2018 that this was not the right path. We also hear from the general public in this quote, "And with this move, the women's ski jumping movement has removed any hopes it may have had of becoming legitimate in the eyes of these spectators, the sporting community, and likely even fellow athletes. It is no longer a sport, but a misguided feminist cause that brings a black eye to anyone actually fighting for women's rights." In contrast to these outside perspectives, my perspectives on the lawsuit and our fight for equality were a little different. Using an English assignment I wrote the year following the Olympics in 2011, I documented the journey of the lawsuit between 2008 and 2009 from my perspective. I reflect on when I became a plaintiff in the lawsuit, highlighting that the hour that it took to become legally involved in the court case did not justify how incredibly emotional the journey was. I document the heartbreak of the BC Supreme Court decision that would recognize the discrimination faced by women ski jumpers, but that did not lead to a women's ski jumping event being added to the Games, and declare that this is not the end. This fight for our equality would not be over until women's ski jumping was an official event at the Winter Olympic Games. And finally, I depict the final efforts of women ski jumpers through the avenue of the lawsuit and the disappointment and perseverance that followed in its wake, by stating that keeping hope would be worth it, because one day, whether that day was tomorrow or in years, I knew one day women would be ski jumping in the Winter Olympics. As part of my autoethnographic inquiry, I write my 5-part metaphor of ski jumping from the perspective of myself as an athlete, connecting my lived experiences as a ski jumping athlete and a plaintiff in the court case with the history of women's ski jumping and the lawsuit as presented in the literature. And I discuss how these to illustrate how these experiences of exclusion, discrimination, and resistance become embodied. I separate my metaphor of ski jumping into 5 separate parts: walking up the in-run, getting on the bar, going down the in-run, takeoff and flight, and the landing. However, I do want to emphasize the interconnectedness of all 5 parts, as can be seen in this next video of me ski jumping. Part 1, walking up the in-run. The beginning of the jump does not start at the top, but at the bottom with a set of stairs that must first be overcome. As I walk up the metal stairs, I can feel my legs getting warmer. The anticipation of the jump ahead is building. Unlike walking up in sneakers and shorts, the pressure of the skis on my shoulder, the awkward angle of my boots, and the compression of my suit make every step slower, with more resistance. The pressure of my skis on my shoulder is not the only weight that I am carrying at this moment. The weight of the history of discrimination, exclusion, gendered expectations, and stereotypes of women ski jumpers sit heavy on my shoulders. My breath starts to get heavy and I feel warm as I reach the top. Getting on the bar. I've now made it to the top. There is the hum of excitement, nerves, and focus as we all wait our turn. I lay my skis down by the gate that I have chosen. It may be at a different height than some of the men, but we are all equal up here, waiting for the opportunity to give it our all. I clip one boot in my bindings after the other, closing the toe piece and ensuring the heel pieces are firmly in. I bend down, using the heel of my wrist to make sure my bindings are secure. Tap, tap. Once my skis, boots, and bindings are secure, I make my way onto the bar. It's a little slick, but nothing I'm not used to. I click my skis into the tracks, double check my bindings for good measure, and wait for my coach's flag. It is my turn now. The hustling and bustling at the top of the jump fades. There is a moment here when everything goes quiet. Looking down the in-run and out into the surrounding landscape, everything becomes possible. Imagined futures beyond the patriarchy sit on the horizon. A quick flag and a hup from my coach. It's time. Going down the in-run. I let go of the bar and quickly get into position. I feel the balance in my feet, my arms by my side, and my eyes forward as I accelerate down the ramp. The speed builds, and so does my anticipation. The acceleration down the in-run is loud, but I don't hear anything. As I approach the takeoff, I must be precise. If I start to jump too early or too late, my efforts will not be fully realized. Instead, I rely on intuition, feeling, and the muscle memory of thousands of previous jumps. This is all on me. I can feel the power in my legs, with muscle built from hours of training and workouts, pushing myself to the limit. The sacrifices, hardships, successes, injuries, recovery, and determination all come down to this one moment. My time is now. I jump. Takeoff and flight. While the in-run and takeoff are within my control, the flight is subject to outside forces. Wind, atmospheric pressure, snow conditions, and weather all combine together to help or hinder flight. Wind is the biggest factor. If the wind is coming up the hill as a headwind, it lifts me up and helps me soar. If the wind is coming down the hill as a tailwind, it drags me down to the ground. While there are little orange flags scattered up and down the jump as indicators of wind, you really don't know the impact of those outside forces until you try and fly. Trying to fly without support in a dispiriting environment leaves me with feelings of disappointment, failure, and heartbreak. If only I could have jumped harder or trained more, maybe I could have made up for those poor conditions and lack of support. It's easy to blame myself when the conditions seem unwavering, unchanging. Sometimes it is possible to beat the odds and create your own support through good technique and strength. But more often than not, you need something in the atmosphere to shift. When a shift in the conditions happens and the headwind is lightly blowing, it feels almost like a weight has been lifted. Everything feels a little lighter. I jump off the takeoff and enter my flight. I can already feel the pressure building. The pressure continues to build, firmly supporting my skis, body, and soul. This is going to be a good one. I'm relaxed and full of excitement. All my hard work has paid off. I feel supported, determined, and full of promise. All I have to do now is hold my position, relax, and soar to the bottom of the hill. The landing. Landing is the easy part. I ease out of my flight and bring my skis back underneath my body. They have done their part. I bend my knees slightly, put one foot in front of the other, and touch back down again on solid ground. Once the hill flattens entirely, the only thing I need to do now is to make my way to a stop, remove my skis, and head back up to the top. It's time for another jump. Now moving on to my reflective analysis. My experiences as an athlete between 2007 and 2014 were shaped by discrimination, legal barriers, and exclusion, as demonstrated by walking up the in-run. However, the possibility and hope brought by the women's ski jumping lawsuit represents the promise and opportunity of getting on the bar. The tailwind represents the outside forces of oppression and patriarchy in the sport in the flight. Women's ski jumpers and headwind and women ski jumpers fostered community and unity by acting as a headwind for other women ski jumpers, practicing resistance and ultimately changing the atmosphere for women in sport, as represented in the takeoff and flight. Landing. The perseverance of women ski jumpers represents perseverance of women ski jumpers in the face of doubt. The efforts of elite women ski jumpers and plaintiffs created the atmospheric change in women ski jumping that inspired me and subsequent generations of women ski jumpers to head back up and take another jump. Our efforts eventually led to a women's ski jumping event being added in the 2014 Winter Olympic Games in Sochi, Russia, where future generations of athletes soared. In conclusion, my experiences as a women's ski jumping athlete and plaintiff in the court case add a unique perspective to existing literature on women in ski jumping and the Sagan versus Van Ock lawsuit. I illustrate the interconnection and embodiment of the structural barriers of patriarchy and sexism on the lives of women ski jumpers between 2007 and 2014. Ultimately, by putting this on the record, I hope to have contributed to feminist sport history and the experiences of women and girls in sport from an athlete's perspective. Thank you.